Have you ever wondered what your great-great-great-grandfather ate for dinner? I don't mean chicken or bread. I mean the things that grew in his garden that don't exist anymore. Imagine walking into a supermarket, but instead of carrots and potatoes, you see strange, twisted roots and dark, mysterious leaves. There is a whole world of food that history has forgotten, flavors that healed wounds and roots that tasted like oysters. Today, we are going to dig them up. We are going to taste the past. So, get ready. Hello friends, I am glad you are here because we are about to do something special. Usually, when we talk about history, we talk about loud things. We talk about wars. We talk about kings. We talk about castles falling down. But tonight is going to be quiet. We are going to talk about the soil. We are going to talk about the dirt under our fingernails. We are exploring a world that is hidden right beneath our feet. It is a quiet, earthy world filled with flavors that you have probably never tasted. These are the vegetables that were once grown by medieval farmers. Think about that time. There were no grocery stores. There were no trucks bringing food from other countries. If you wanted to eat, you had to grow it. You had to tend to the earth with rough hands and simple tools. These vegetables weren't harvested to look pretty on a shelf. They were harvested to keep people alive. They went into big pots of stew sitting on stone hearths. They were mashed into bowls of healing pottage to keep the cold away. Some of these bitter greens were served to knights who were recovering from sword wounds. Some of these root vegetables were so strong and hardy that they fed entire families through the freezing winter snows when nothing else would grow. These crops were once essential. They were the difference between life and death. And yet, now, most of us have never even heard their names. So, before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy our content. And please, tell us where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Sometimes our stories are too interesting for sleep, and sometimes we do try to make them a bit boring for bedtime. Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan for some gentle background noise, and let's cover what we have for tonight together. Let's start with something that sounds like a secret code. Scurrant. Say it with me. Scurrant. It sounds harsh, doesn't it? But the taste was anything but harsh. In the quiet soil of medieval Europe, long before the potato ever came across the ocean to change everything, scurrant was the king. Today, its name is barely even whispered. If you asked a modern farmer about scurrant, they might look at you with confusion. Yet, once upon a time, this plant was as common as the onion. It grew in the gardens of monks and in the small plots of land behind peasant cottages. If you want to be fancy and scientific, the name is Sium Caesarum. But the medieval peasants didn't care about Latin names. They cared about flavor, and scurrant was a root vegetable that was pale and tender. It had a secret. It was naturally sweet. Imagine a time when sugar was rare. Sugar was for kings and queens. For a normal person, sweetness was a luxury. So, a vegetable that tasted sweet, that tasted almost like nuts, that was a treasure. Scurrant was especially loved in the monasteries. Monks lived simple lives. They couldn't go to the market and buy exotic spices. They had to find flavor in their own backyard, and scurrant gave them that. Now, picture a carrot. A carrot is one big, thick orange root, right? Scurrant wasn't like that. It was messy. It grew in a tangled cluster of slender roots. Imagine a bunch of white pencils all twisted together. That is what scurrant looked like. Preparing it took patience. You had to pull up this tangle of roots. You had to wash the dirt off. Then you had to peel each little root. But the reward was worth it. They would boil them or roast them. Often, they would mash them up into a creamy white paste. They would add a little pepper or some oil. The flavor was mild but deep. It tasted a bit like a parsnip, and a bit like a suncoke. With that earthy sweetness I mentioned, it paired perfectly with the other things growing nearby: garlic, onions, and herbs. In some recipes, people even treated it like candy. They would glaze it with honey, or they would bake it into savory tarts with eggs and cheese. It was versatile, but the reason scurrant was a superstar wasn't just the taste. It was because the plant was tough. Scurrant loved the cold. It loved damp soil. And let's be honest, Northern Europe is often cold and damp. Unlike some vegetables that die if you look at them wrong, scurrant didn't demand much. It was a perennial. That means you plant it once, and it comes back year after year. It could be harvested deep into the winter, Imagine it is January. The ground is frozen hard as rock. The wheat is gone. The apples are gone. But you can go out to the garden, dig through the frost, and find skirt waiting for you. To a medieval farmer, that dependability was everything. It was the perfect peasant's crop. But don't think it was only for the poor. Skirt appears in the records of kings, too. It was listed in the garden inventories of massive manor houses. Even King Henry VIII, the guy with all the wives, his gardener, reportedly grew skirt in the royal beds. So, here is the big question. What happened? Why are we not eating skirt fries today? The answer is simple. The potato. When explorers brought the potato back from the Americas in the 16th century, it changed the world. Potatoes were huge. They were easy to dig up. You didn't have to peel 100 tiny roots, you just peeled one big one. They filled your stomach faster. The potato was a bully. It pushed skirt out of the garden. People wanted convenience. Skirt was delicate. The potato was a powerhouse. So, skirt was quietly forgotten. But beneath the earth, in some old gardens, the seeds remain, waiting for the light. Let's move from the roots to the leaves. Let's talk about a plant with a very royal name. Good King Henry. This plant grew in the shadows of stone walls. It grew along the edges of the fields where the plow couldn't reach. It wasn't a king, but in a way, it ruled the garden. It was known affectionately as poor man's asparagus. This was a faithful friend to the medieval peasant. It grew where little else would survive. It had dark green leaves and tender shoots. It gave food year after year and asked for almost no care in return. Today, if you saw it, you would probably think it was a weed. You might pull it out. But back then, good King Henry was as vital as bread. Where did the name come from? Some people think it refers to King Henry, but scholars think it actually comes from old German words meaning home ruler. Why? Because this plant liked people. It grew close to the house, close to the stables. It was like a pet dog that stays near the porch. Others say it was named after a spirit, a goblin called Heinz, who helped around the house. Whatever the reason, the name stuck. It was a staple across Britain and the Alps. The best part of the plant was the young shoots. In the early spring, when the snow melted, these shoots would poke out of the ground. Farmers would cut them and boil them. They tasted like asparagus, soft, slightly bitter, and deeply green. After a winter of eating dried beans and salted meat, tasting something fresh and green must have felt like a miracle. Later in the summer, the leaves would get big and triangular. People would pick them and cook them like spinach. They would throw them into big pots of pottage, a thick soup, or bake them into rustic pies. The leaves were tough, but they were rich in iron. For a hard-working farmer, this was high-octane fuel. But good King Henry did more than just feed people. The seeds were ground up and used for medicine. The roots were dried for sheep. Even the asha, if you burned the leaf, as it was used to make soap. In a time when you couldn't waste anything, this plant proved its worth every single day. It was low maintenance. Modern vegetables are spoiled. They need special water, special fertilizer. Good King Henry didn't care. It grew in bad soil. It grew near the manure pile. It was a survivor. So why did it disappear? Why don't we buy good King Henry salads? Because it was rough. As farming got better, people started growing spinach. Spinach was softer. It tasted milder. People started growing real asparagus, which was bigger. Good King Henry was seen as old-fashioned. It was seen as food for poor people. It had a slightly bitter taste that people started to dislike as their diets improved. Also, the seeds were slow to sprout. Farmers wanted fast crops. So, the good king was dethroned. But for centuries, it was the silent ally of the poor, standing guard by the cottage door. Now, let's look at something truly strange. Let's talk about the vegetable that tricks your brain. This is salsify. In the frost-hardened beds of the medieval kitchen garden, there grew a root with a very strange reputation. People called it the oyster plant. Now, think about that. This is a root. It grows in the dirt. It has never seen the ocean. It has never seen a boat. And yet, when you boil its creamy white flesh, it tastes faintly of oysters. To us, that sounds weird. Maybe even suspicious. Why would a vegetable taste like seafood? But imagine living in the middle of Europe in the year 1400. There are no refrigerated trucks. There are no airplanes. If you lived far from the coast, you never ate fresh seafood. The only fish you ate was dried or salted, and it tasted like leather. So, salsify was a luxury. It was a prized winter delicacy. The root looked humble. It was long and thin, like a skinny carrot, but it had tough, hairy skin. It wasn't pretty, but inside it was magic. Salsify thrived in the cold. You planted it in the spring and let it grow slowly all summer. But here is the trick. You didn't harvest it when it got cold. You waited for the frost. You waited for the ice to cover the ground. The cold did something to the root. It changed the starches into sugar. The frost made it sweeter. It signaled that the salsify was ready. For the medieval cook, salsify was a labor of love. You couldn't just rinse it. You had to scrub it hard. You had to peel the hairy skin. Then you had to soak it in water immediately, or it would turn brown. It was high maintenance, but once prepared, you could boil it, stew it, or mash it. The texture was soft, almost silky. It thickened soups perfectly, and that mild oyster flavor brought a complexity to the meal that you couldn't get anywhere else. It was also medicine. The herbal books from the monasteries said salsify could cure snake bites. They said it could cure melancholia, which is the old word for depression. They thought the milky juice inside the root had purifying powers. Despite how good it was, salsify never became a superstar like the onion or the turnip. Why? Because it was too much work. It was hard to clean. The roots were brittle and would snap when you pulled them out. When the big, tough vegetables like potatoes came along, salsify was pushed to the side. It became a niche vegetable for rich people or monks with lots of time. Today, you might find it in a very fancy restaurant. Let's move on to an herb that time forgot. Its name is powerful. Alexander's. Long before parsley and celery took over our kitchens, medieval farmers relied on Alexander's. This was a plant that looked like it could take over the world. It had tall, hollow stalks and deep green leaves. It stood almost 6 feet high. In the Middle Ages, Alexander's was a celebrity. It grew everywhere along the roadsides, inside the monastery walls, beside the castles. It was as familiar to them as ketchup is to us. The Romans were the ones who brought it to Britain. They loved it, and for 1,000 years, it was essential. This plant was the Swiss Army knife of cooking. Every single part of it was useful. The leaves, you chopped them up to add spice to soups. The stems, you blanched them and ate them like asparagus. The seeds, they were spicy and peppery. And even the roots were roasted and eaten. One of the coolest things about Alexander's was where it liked to live. It loved salt. It grew near the ocean, on the cliffs where the sea spray hit the land. Most plants die in salty soil. Alexander's loved it. This made it incredibly valuable for monks who lived in coastal abbeys. It provided fresh greens during the Hungry Gap. Do you know what the Hungry Gap is? It is that terrible time in early spring when your winter food storage is almost empty, but the new summer crops haven't grown yet. It is a time of starvation. But Alexander's was there. It popped up early. It saved lives. The flavor was strong. It was bitter, peppery, and smelled like myrrh. You have to remember, medieval food could be very boring. Spices like black pepper or cinnamon were incredibly expensive. Only the rich could afford them. So for the common people, Alexander's was their spice rack. It gave their bland barley soup a punch of flavor. But then came celery. Celery was related to Alexander's, but it was milder. It was less bitter. It was crisper. Gardeners found celery easier to control. Alexander's was aggressive. It spread like a weed. So, people stopped planting it. They let it go wild. Today, if you walk along the coastal cliffs of Britain, you can still see it growing wild. It is a ghost of the past. It stands there tall and green, waiting for a cook who never comes. It is a sign of spring, a burst of green after the winter gray, and a taste of something that was once ordinary, but is now lost. This next one sounds like a magic spell. Scorzonera. If salsify was the oyster plant, Scorzonera was the black viper. It sat tucked beneath the soil like a dark secret. It was one of the most intriguing vegetables in the medieval garden. Imagine pulling a root out of the ground that looks like a burnt stick. It has black, bark-like skin. It looks dead. It looks unappetizing. But you know the saying, don't judge a book by its cover. Well, don't judge a root by its skin. Once you peeled away that black, rough exterior, the inside was pearly white. And the taste, it was shocking. It was buttery. It was sweet. It was smoother than a carrot and sweeter than a parsnip. Sometimes called black salsify, It had its own loyal fans. The name scorzonera likely comes from an old Italian word meaning black bark, but there is another theory. People called it viper's herb. Why viper? Because they believed it could cure snake bites. In the medieval world, death could come from anywhere: a tiny scratch, a bad fever, or a snake in the grass. So, vegetables weren't just food, they were a pharmacy. Apothecaries, the old pharmacists, would dry the scorzonera roots. They would grind them into powder. They would give this powder to people who were bitten by snakes, or people suffering from the plague, or even people who were just sad. Did it work? Probably not for snake bites, but the placebo effect is a powerful thing. For the farmer, scorzonera was a good friend. It grew slowly, but it was steady. It didn't mind the cold. However, harvesting it was a nightmare. The roots were long and brittle. If you pulled too hard, they snapped in half and stayed in the ground. You had to be gentle. In the kitchen, it was versatile. The monks boiled it. The nobles baked it into savory pies. Some chefs even paired it with honey and vinegar to bring out that sweet, buttery taste. But again, convenience killed the scorzonera. Why spend 10 minutes peeling a thin, black, brittle root when you can peel a big, fat orange carrot in 10 seconds? The modern world is always in a rush, and scorzonera is a vegetable that demands patience. So, it faded away, but it remains a reminder that beneath the roughest skin, something golden might be waiting. Now, get ready for the strangest fruit you have ever heard of. This is the medlar. If you saw a medlar fruit, you probably wouldn't want to eat it. It looks like a small, brown apple that has seen better days. It has a weird, open bottom that looks like a star. In Old English, they gave it a very rude nickname because of how it looked. They called it the open ass. Yes, really, medieval people had a sense of humor, too. But the medlar was special because it broke all the rules. With an apple or a pear, you pick it when it is ripe, and you eat it fresh. If you leave it too long, it rots, and you throw it away. The medlar is the opposite. If you eat a medlar fresh off the tree, it is terrible. It is hard, sour, and makes your mouth feel dry. You cannot eat it. To eat a medlar, you have to let it rot. There is a special word for this process. It is called bledding. You would pick the fruit in late autumn. Then, you would lay it out on straw or a wooden shelf in a cool room, and you would wait. You would wait for weeks. The skin would start to wrinkle. The fruit would turn dark brown. It would get soft and squishy. To a modern person, it looks like garbage. But to a medieval person, it was ready. Once it was bledded, the inside turned into a soft, sweet custard. It tasted like spicy applesauce mixed with wine and cinnamon. You could eat it with a spoon right out of the skin. This was valuable because the medlar ripened in winter. In December, there were no strawberries, there were no peaches. The world was gray and cold. But the medlar was there. It was a winter treat. It was often served at Christmas feasts, mashed up with cream or baked into tarts. The medlar was also a symbol. Poets used it to talk about aging. They used it to talk about how things that look ugly can be sweet on the inside. Shakespeare wrote about the medlar. It was a fruit for thinkers. So why did we stop eating it? Because we are impatient. We want fruit that we can buy at the store and eat in the car on the way home. We don't want to buy fruit and let it sit on a shelf for 3 weeks until it looks like it's rotting. The medlar requires time, and in our fast world, time is the one thing we don't have. Finally, for this section, let's talk about a vegetable that is famous for a reason you might not expect. Rampion. You might not know the name rampion, but you know the story associated with it. Have you heard of Rapunzel, the fairy tale girl with the long hair? Her name, Rapunzel, comes from the German name for this plant, Rapunzel Glockenblume. In the original story, a pregnant woman looks over a wall into a witch's garden. She sees this plant growing. She craves it so badly that she thinks she will die if she doesn't eat it. Her husband climbs the wall to steal it, and the witch catches him. The price for the theft is the baby girl Rapunzel. That story tells us something important. It tells us how delicious rampion was. It was so good, it was worth stealing from a witch. Rampion was a quiet hero of the garden. It had soft, edible leaves and slender white roots. It was a 2-in-1 vegetable. In the spring, you ate the leaves like spinach in your salad. In the winter, you pulled up the roots. They were crisp and sweet, like a radish but milder. It was easy to grow, It didn't need rich soil. It grew happily in the small plots of land behind peasant houses. It helped bridge the gap between seasons. But as agriculture became big business, rampion was too small. The roots weren't big enough to sell by the ton. Spinach grew faster. Radishes grew quicker. Rampion was left behind in the fairy tales. Today, it is a rarity. It is more likely to be found in a storybook than in a soup pot. But once, it grew behind every cottage, green, quiet, and full of life. We are not done digging yet. We have seen roots that taste like oysters and plants that were stolen by witches. But the medieval garden was huge. If you look in the shaded corners, under the big leaves, and along the rocky coastlines, there are more secrets hiding there. Let's keep going. Imagine a garden in a monastery. It is quiet. Monks in brown robes are walking slowly between the rows of plants. In the darkest, coolest corner of that garden, they are growing something delicate. This is chervil root. Now, be careful not to confuse this with the herb chervil. The herb is green and looks like parsley. We still use that today. But the root, that is a different treasure entirely. Chervil root was small. It looked like a short, stubby carrot with light brown skin. It wasn't impressive to look at. If you saw it lying on the ground, you might think it was a piece of dead wood. But inside, the flesh was ivory white, and the flavor was sophisticated. Medieval food is often described as bland or gruel, but chervil root was proof that they had refined tastes, too. When you boiled or roasted this root, it developed a sweet, nutty flavor. People said it tasted like roasted chestnuts mixed with a tiny hint of licorice. It was a fancy vegetable. It wasn't grown in the massive fields by peasants who needed to feed 100 people. It was grown in the small, carefully tended gardens of people who appreciated good food. It was soothing. It was gentle on the stomach. Monks loved it because they believed food should nourish the soul as well as the body. They would boil it and serve it with butter, or they would mash it up like turnips. Some old recipes even used it in sweet cakes or puddings, mixing it with honey and cinnamon for a holiday treat. So, why did it vanish? Because chervil root was a diva. It was high maintenance. First of all, the seeds were difficult. They didn't last long. You had to plant them almost immediately. Then, once planted, they took forever to sprout, sometimes weeks. And the growing season? It could take up to 9 months just to get these tiny little roots. Farmers or businessmen, they looked at the chervil root and said, 9 months for a tiny root? No thanks. They preferred carrots and parsnips that grew big and fast. So, the delicate, chestnut-flavored root was left behind in the monastery gardens, fading away as the world got faster and louder. Now, let's leave the quiet monastery garden and go somewhere wild. Let's go to the ocean. Imagine the coast of medieval England or France. The wind is howling. The salt spray is hitting your face. The ground is rocky and sandy. Nothing grows here, right? Wrong. Meet sea kale, the vegetable of the ocean. Before people learned how to build greenhouses, this plant was a miracle. It grew wild on the beaches. It had thick, blue-green leaves and tough stems. To the fishermen and coastal villagers, this wasn't a weed, it was survival. Sea kale had a flavor that was somewhere between cabbage and asparagus. It was earthy, salty, and nutty. But the medieval farmers figured out a trick to make it taste even better. In the early spring, just as the shoots were starting to come out of the sand, they would cover them up. They would pile sand on top of the plant, or put a clay pot over it. This blocked the sunlight. Because the plant couldn't see the sun, it didn't turn green. It stayed white. It stayed tender. It grew into crisp, ivory-colored stalks. When they harvested these white stalks, they were crisp and juicy. They would boil them or steam them and serve them with butter. It was considered a delicacy. It was the first fresh vegetable of the year for people living by the sea. The roots were edible, too, though they were tough. The big ruffled leaves could be cooked like cabbage. It was a plant that gave everything it had. But sea kale stayed a local secret. It didn't travel well. It needed that salty, sandy soil to be happy. Inland farmers didn't know how to grow it. It was too picky. As trains and trucks started moving food around the world, sea kale was replaced by standard cabbage and broccoli. But for a long time, it was the taste of the coast, a reminder that the ocean could feed us more than just fish. Now, let's talk about fire. In a time before chili peppers came to Europe from the Americas, how did people add heat to their food? How did they clear their sinuses? They used horseradish. You probably know horseradish today as a white sauce in a jar that you put on roast beef. But in the Middle Ages, it was a beast of a plant. Horseradish is a root. It looks rough and scarred, but when you grate it, when you scratch the surfacia, it releases a chemical oil that hits you like a punch in the face. It brings tears to your eyes. It burns your nose. In a world without refrigerators, meat often tasted old. It wasn't rotten, but it wasn't fresh. It was salted, dried, or smoked. It could be tough and gamey. Horseradish was the solution. A spoonful of grated horseradish could wake up any meal. It cut through the fat. It made the boring salted pork taste exciting. But it wasn't just a condiment. It was powerful medicine. If you had a cold, a cough, or aching joints, the village herbalist would give you horseradish. They believed the heat would burn out the sickness. They would make a tea from it, or mash it into a paste to put on sore muscles. The plant itself was rugged. In fact, it was too rugged. Once you planted horseradish in your garden, you could never get rid of it. The roots went deep. If you tried to dig it up and left even a tiny piece behind, it would grow back. It was aggressive. Farmers often planted it in the corner, far away from the other vegetables, just to keep it contained. It was the wild animal of the garden. It reminded the medieval people that the earth wasn't always soft and gentle. Sometimes, the earth bites back. Here is a mystery for you. What do you get if you cross parsley and celery? You get parcel. Even the name sounds like a mix. Parcel was a quiet hybrid that grew in medieval gardens. It looked like parsley, with those nice flat green leaves, but the stems were thicker and crunchier. Like celery, it was the best of both worlds. Today, you have to buy parsley for the leaves and celery for the stalks. But parcel gave you both in one plant. It was efficient. In the Middle Ages, efficiency was key. You didn't have a lot of space. A plant that could do two jobs was a winner. Cooks used the leaves to flavor stews and pottages. They chopped up the stalks to add crunch to their meals. It was an aromatic herb and a vegetable at the same time. It was also used to freshen breath. After a meal of onions and garlic, chewing on a sprig of parsley would clean your palate. It was good for digestion. So why is it gone? Specialization. Over time, farmers bred celery to be bigger, crunchier, and juicier. They bred parsley to be leafier. Parsley was stuck in the middle, not quite a great vegetable, not quite a perfect herb. It was a jack of all trades, master of none. So, it faded away. But for centuries, it was the unsung hero of the kitchen pot. If parsley was the quiet hero, lovage was the giant. Imagine an herb that grows 6 feet tall. It towers over everything else in the garden. This is lovage. If you have never tasted lovage, it is hard to describe. It tastes like celery, but multiplied by 10. It is spicy, intense, and strong. Some people call it the magi plant because it tastes like that strong soup seasoning. In the medieval garden, lovage was a sentinel. It stood guard at the back of the plot. It came back every year, bigger and stronger. Because the flavor was so strong, you didn't need much. Just a few leaves could flavor a massive pot of soup that had to feed a whole family. This was crucial for peasants. If you only had water, barley, and a few onions, the soup would taste like dirty water. But throw in a leaf of lovage, suddenly, it tasted rich and savory. It tricked your tongue into thinking you were eating a meat stew. It was also a medicine cabinet. Monks used lovage to treat sore throats and stomach aches. They believed it warmed the body. They even used the roots. But lovage had a downfall. It was too strong. As cooking styles changed and became more refined, people wanted lighter flavors. They wanted gentle parsley and chervil. Lovage was too loud. It dominated the dish. So, the giant was banished from the garden. Now, let's talk about a weed. If you see this plant in your garden today, you probably pull it out and throw it in the compost. It is called fat hen. It has a funny name. Why fat hen? Because chickens absolutely loved it. If you fed this plant to your chickens, they would get fat and happy. But it wasn't just for birds. This was the spinach of the medieval world before spinach arrived. It grew everywhere. You didn't even have to plant it. It popped up in the manure piles, on the side of the road, and in between the rows of wheat. It was free food. To a peasant family with no money, fat hen was a blessing. It was packed with vitamins, iron, calcium, vitamin A. It was incredibly healthy. They would gather baskets of it and boil it down into a green mash. It saved people from starvation. When the wheat harvest failed, or when the taxes were too high to afford meat, people survived on fat hen. But humans are funny. We value things that are hard to get. Because fat hen was free and grew like a weed, people stopped respecting it. When spinach arrived, which you had to buy seeds for and plant carefully, people decided spinach was better. Fat hen became poor people food, and eventually, it became just a weed. Let's go back to the coast for one more. This is gram, or wild cabbage. Before we had nice, round, green balls of cabbage in the supermarket, we had this wild, messy ancestor. It clung to the cliffs of Europe. It grew out of cracks in the rock where no other plant could survive. It looked ghostly. The leaves were thick and blue-gray. It had to be tough to survive the salt spray and the freezing winds. The flavor was bitter. But if you are hungry, bitter is better than nothing. Farmers learned that if you boiled it for a long time, the bitterness went away. It became soft and filling. It was a staple for people living on the edge of the world. But gram was never truly tamed. You couldn't organize it into neat little rows like modern cabbage. It was wild at heart. And as farming became more organized and industrial, there was no room for a wild plant. We traded resilience for convenience. Finally, let's look at the turnip. We still eat turnips today, but usually, we eat the root of the white and purple ball that grows underground. But in the medieval world, the best part wasn't the root, it was the green top. Today, when you buy turnips, the greens are often chopped off and thrown away. But back then, those greens were a celebration. Turnip greens were often the very first vegetable to appear in the spring. After a long, dark winter of eating salted meat and dry bread, seeing those bright green leaves poking out of the soil was a sign of hope. It meant winter was over. They were spicy, peppery, and full of life. People would boil them and eat them with such joy. They were used to clean the blood after winter. They were a tonic. We have largely forgotten this. We focus so much on the root that we throw away the crown. So, there you have it. The lost garden, scurrant, salsify, lovage, fat hen. These aren't just plants. They are memories. They are the flavors that built the world we live in today. They fed the serfs, the knights, and the monks. They are sleeping under the soil, waiting for us to remember them. But now, we must leave the humble soil of Europe. We must leave the quiet gardens and the peasant cottages. We are going to travel thousands of miles to the east. We are going to a place where the soil isn't used for vegetables, but for supporting the weight of a broken heart. We are going to India. The year is 1631. An emperor is screaming in grief, and from his tears, he is about to build the most beautiful thing the world has ever seen. We have spent a long time looking at the ground, digging for roots and herbs. But now, I want you to look up. We are leaving the quiet, green gardens of medieval Europe. We are traveling thousands of miles to the east. We are going to the banks of the river in India. Or an heirloom seed catalog, but for the most part, the oyster of the earth has gone back to sleep in the soil. Here, the soil wasn't used to grow vegetables. It was used to hold up the weight of a broken heart. We are going to talk about a building that everyone knows, but very few people truly understand. You have seen the pictures. You know the White Dome. You know the name, the Taj Mahal. But do you know the secret of the wooden foundation that keeps it from sinking? Do you know about the Black Taj that was never built? Do you know that what you see when you walk inside is actually a lie? Let's peel back the marble and look at the truth. The year is 1631. The place is the Mughal Empire in India. This was a time of incredible wealth and power. The emperor was a man named Shah Jahan. His name literally means king of the world. He had armies. He had gold. He had diamonds the size of eggs. He could have anything he wanted with a snap of his fingers. But in the summer of 1631, the king of the world was helpless. He was in a military camp, far from home. His wife, Mumtaz Mahal, was with him. She wasn't just his wife, she was his everything. She traveled with him to wars. She advised him on politics. They were inseparable. But on that day, she was giving birth to their 14th child. Something went wrong. The doctors tried everything, but they couldn't save her. Mumtaz Mahal died. The legends say that when she died, the emperor didn't just cry, he shattered. He locked himself in his tent for 8 days. He refused to eat. He refused to see anyone. When he finally came out, his hair, which had been jet black, had turned snow white. His back was hunched. The sparkle was gone from his eyes. He banned music in the entire empire. He stopped wearing colored clothes. He lived in white, the color of mourning. But Shah Jahan had a promise to keep. Before she died, Mumtaz asked him for one thing. She asked him to build a resting place for her that was unlike anything the world had ever seen. So, the grieving emperor made a vow. He would build a monument to his love. It wouldn't just be a grave. It would be a picture of heaven on earth. To build heaven, you need more than just money. You need genius. Shah Jahan didn't just hire a local builder. He sent out a call to the entire world. He wanted the best minds from Persia, Turkey, India, and Central Asia. The head architect was likely a man named Ustad Ahmad Lahori. He was a visionary. He didn't just draw a building, he drew a poem made of stone. But a drawing is useless without hands to build it. Imagine the scene. Over 20,000 workers were brought to the site in the city of Agra. 20,000. That is the population of a small town. There were stone cutters, carvers, painters, calligraphers, and laborers. And they had help. 1,000 elephants were used to drag the massive blocks of marble. This wasn't a quick project. It took 22 years to finish. Imagine working on one building for 22 years. A child born when the first stone was laid would be a grown man by the time the dome was finished. They didn't use local stone. They wanted the best. The white marble came from a place called Mkrana, which was over 200 miles away. This marble was special. It wasn't just white, it was translucent. That means light could glow through it. They brought jade from China, turquoise from Tibet, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, sapphires from Sri Lanka. The Taj Mahal isn't just a building in India. It is a puzzle piece made of the entire world. Deep Dive 18. The Impossible Foundation. Now, let's talk about the engineering, because this is where the story gets scary. Shah Jahan wanted the Taj Mahal to be built right on the edge of the Yamuna River. He wanted the reflection of the building to shimmer in the water. It was a romantic idea, but for an engineer, it was a nightmare. You see, riverbanks are soft. The soil is muddy and wet. If you build a massive stone mountain on top of wet mud, what happens? It sinks, it cracks, it falls over. The engineers told the emperor, "We can't build here. The ground is too soft." But the emperor didn't care about physics. He cared about his vision. He said, "Find a way." So, the engineers did something brilliant. They invented a new kind of foundation. They dug massive wells deep into the muddy soil. They dug them down until they hit the hard earth below. Then, they filled these wells with rocks and rubble to create strong pillars. But here is the secret part. To connect these pillars, they used wood. Massive logs of ebony wood. Now, you might be thinking, wood, in the wet mud, won't it rot? Usually, yes, wood rots when it gets wet and then dries out. But if wood stays completely submerged in water, and no oxygen gets to it, it can last for thousands of years. The engineers knew that the river would keep the wood wet forever. So, the Taj Mahal, this giant marble palace, is actually floating on a platform of wood and wells. But there is a danger today. The river is drying up. As the water level drops, the wood is being exposed to air. Some experts worry that if the wood dries out and rots, the Taj Mahal could tilt or crack. The monument is standing on a delicate balance of water and wood. Why did they choose white marble? It wasn't just because it looked expensive. It was because of the light. The Taj Mahal changes color. If you go at sunrise, the marble reflects the pink and orange of the morning sun. It looks soft, like a rose. If you go at noon, when the sun is high, the marble is blinding white. It looks strong and powerful. If you go at sunset, it turns gold. And if you go at night, under the full moon, it glows with a ghostly silver blue. The poets said this was intentional. They said the changing colors represented the different moods of a woman, or they represented the different moods of God. It is a building that is never the same twice. The Mughals were obsessed with symmetry. Symmetry means that if you draw a line down the middle, both sides are exactly the same. The Taj Mahal is the champion of symmetry. The gardens are divided into 4 perfect squares. The mosque on one side is mirrored by a guest house on the other side. Even the shapes carved into the walls are perfectly balanced. But there is one thing that is not symmetrical, one tiny detail that breaks the perfection. If you walk into the central chamber, you will see the tombs. In the exact center of the room lies the tomb of Mumtaz Mahal. It is perfectly placed, but right next to her, squeezed into the side, is the tomb of the emperor, Shah Jahan. It looks out of place. It is bigger than hers, and it sits off-center. It ruins the perfect symmetry of the room. Why? Because the Taj Mahal was never meant to hold him. It was built only for her. When he died, his son decided not to build a new tomb. He just buried his father next to his mother. So, in this perfect palace of math and geometry, the only thing that doesn't fit is the emperor himself. It is a tragic irony. Look at the 4 tall towers that stand at the corners of the platform. These are called minarets. They look straight, don't they? But they aren't. If you measure them carefully, you will see that they all lean slightly outward, away from the main dome. This wasn't a mistake. The architects did this on purpose. They lived in a time of earthquakes. They knew that if a massive earthquake hit Agra, the towers might fall. If the towers stood straight, they might crash inward and destroy the beautiful dome. So, they tilted them outward. If an earthquake strikes, the towers are designed to fall away from the building, saving the tomb. Even in their design, they were thinking about protection. They were thinking about saving her, even if the earth shook. Now, let's talk about the biggest mystery of all, the Black Taj Mahal. There is a legend that has been whispered for hundreds of years. It says that Shah Jahan wasn't finished. The legend says he planned to build a second Taj Mahal on the other side of the river, but this one wouldn't be white. It would be made of pure black marble. The white Taj was for his wife. The black Taj would be for himself, and the 2 buildings would be connected by a bridge made of silver. It sounds incredible. A black mirror image of the White Palace. Is it true? Probably not. Archaeologists have dug on the other side of the river. They found some black stones, but it turns out they were just white stones that had turned black with age and algae. Also, by the time the first Taj was finished, the emperor was broke. He had emptied the treasury, and his son, Aurangzeb, was tired of his father spending all the money. The son overthrew the father and locked him in a prison tower. So, the Black Taj remains a dream, a ghost story, but it adds to the magic. Here is something most tourists don't know. When you visit the Taj Mahal, you walk into the main room. You see 2 beautiful caskets covered in jewels and surrounded by a carved marble screen. You take pictures. You pay your respects. But those caskets are empty. They are fakes. They are meant for the public to see. The real bodies of Mumtaz Mahal and Shah Jahan are not in that beautiful room. They are buried deep underground, in a dark, plain crypt directly beneath the main floor. Why? Because in the Islamic tradition, death is a humble thing. You are not supposed to decorate a grave with gold and jewels. You are supposed to return to the dust simply. So, the emperor built 2 layers. The top layer is for the world to see the grandeur, the wealth, the art. The bottom layer is for Goda, the silence, the dust, and the peace. There is one final story, a dark one. People say that after the Taj Mahal was finished, Shah Jahan ordered the hands of the artisans to be cut off. He did this so they could never build anything so beautiful again. It is a gruesome story. It makes the emperor sound like a monster, but historians say it is almost certainly a lie. There is no record of 20,000 people losing their hands. In fact, we know that the same architects went on to build other buildings for the emperor later on. It is just a myth, a way of saying, this building is unique, nothing can ever equal it. The Taj Mahal is more than just a postcard picture. It is a building that floats on wood. It is a building designed to survive earthquakes. It is a building that hides the dead in the dark while showing the living the light. It is, as the poet Rabindranath Tagore called it, a teardrop on the cheek of time. It reminds us that even the most powerful men in the world, men who call themselves king of the world, are powerless against death. All they can do is build memories in stone. We have looked at the white marble of the Taj Mahal. It is beautiful because it is pure. It reflects the sun. But the world isn't just white and black. The world is full of color. Look around the room you are sitting in right now. Look at your blue shirt. Look at the red rug. Look at the yellow paint on the wall. Today, if you want the color blue, you go to the store and buy a tube of paint for $5. It is easy, it is cheap. But there was a time when the color blue was more expensive than gold. There was a time when the color green could kill you, and there was a time when the color brown was made from. Well, you might not want to know. Let's explore the history of colors you never knew existed. Let's go back to the very beginning. 100,000 years ago, before humans could write, before we built cities, we painted. We used ochre. Ochre is basically colored dirt. It is clay that is rich in iron. It comes in red, yellow, and brown. Early humans found this soft rock, ground it up, mixed it with animal fat or spit, and painted on cave walls. But it wasn't just art, it was spiritual. Red ochre looked like blood. So, when a loved one died, they would cover the body in red powder. It was a way of trying to give them life again, or to protect them in the next world. It was the first time humanity tried to speak without words. For thousands of years, humans had red, yellow, black, and white. But there was one color missing: blue. Look at nature. How many blue animals do you see? How many blue rocks? The sky is blue, but you can't grab a piece of the sky and grind it into paint. The ocean is blue, but if you scoop up the water, it is clear. Blue was the impossible color. The ancient Egyptians were the first to solve this puzzle. They were master chemists. They realized that if you took sand, copper, and calcium, and baked them in an oven at a super high temperature, it turned into a hard, blue glass. They ground this glass into powder. This was Egyptian blue. It was the first synthetic color in human history. They painted their tombs with it because blue represented the Nile River and the heavens. But later, in the Middle Ages, artists found something even better and much more expensive. They found a stone called lapis lazuli. This stone only existed in one place on Earth, the mountains of Afghanistan. It was a deep, sparkling, electric blue. To get this stone to Europe, traders had to carry it on camels across deserts, over mountains, and across the sea. By the time it reached a painter in Italy, it was worth a fortune. Painters called it ultramarine, which means beyond the sea. It was so expensive that painters were terrified to use it. If a rich man commissioned a painting, he would sign a contract specifying exactly how much blue paint would be used. This is why, in almost every classic painting of the Virgin Mary, she is wearing blue robes. It wasn't just a fashion choice, it was the church saying, "We are using our most expensive treasure for the most holy woman." Now, let's talk about the color of power, purple. If you travel back to ancient Rome, you will see something strange. The senators wear white togas with a purple stripe. The emperor wears a solid purple robe, but no one else is wearing purple. Why? Because it was illegal, and because it cost a fortune. This color was called Tyrian purple, and the way they made it is disgusting. They didn't get it from a flower or a berry. They got it from a predatory sea snail called the murex. These snails lived in the Mediterranean Sea. To get the dye, you had to collect thousands of these snails. You had to crack their shells and extract a tiny gland from their body. Then, you had to let these glands rot in giant vats of urine and water for days. The smell was horrific. Ancient writers said the dye factories smelled like death and rotting fish. You could smell a purple dye factory from miles away. It took 12,000 snails to make just 1.4 grams of dye. That is barely enough to dye the trim of a single shirt. That is why only emperors wore it. It was a symbol that said, "I have so much money, I can waste millions of snails just to change the color of my clothes." Now, let's jump forward to the Victorian era. The 1800s. People loved the color green. It reminded them of nature. But making a bright, emerald green paint was hard. Most green paints turned brown after a few years. Then, a chemist named Carl Scheele invented a new green. It was bright. It was vivid. It didn't fade. It was called Scheele's green, or later, Paris green. People went crazy for it. They painted their walls green. They dyed their dresses green. They even put green dye in candy and toys. There was just one problem. To make this green, Scheele used arsenic. Arsenic is a deadly poison, but people didn't realize the danger right away. Imagine a ballroom in London in 1860. The women are wearing beautiful, bright green dresses. As they dance, The fabric rubs together, tiny particles of green dust to arsenic dust to float into the air. The women breathe it in, the men breathe it in. They start to feel dizzy. They get headaches, sometimes. They faint. People thought they were just tired from dancing. Actually, they were being slowly poisoned by their fashion. There is a famous theory that Napoleon Bonaparte died because of this color. When he was exiled to the island of St. Helena, his room was painted bright green. The island was damp. Mold grew on the walls. The mold broke down the paint and released arsenic gas into the room. The Emperor of France may have been killed by his wallpaper. This next one is the most disturbing. If you look at paintings from the 1700s and 1800s, you will see a rich, warm brown color used for shadows and backgrounds. It had a name, mummy brown. You might think, oh, maybe it's called that because it looks like a mummy. Number. It was called that because it was made of mummies. For centuries, Europeans had a strange obsession with ancient Egypt. Travelers would go to Egypt and buy mummies. Not just kings, but cats, peasants, anyone. Paint makers would buy these ancient bodies. They would grind up the bones and the flesh into a powder. They mixed this powder with oil and varnish. Artists were literally painting with the bodies of ancient people. It sounds like a horror movie, but it was real. It wasn't until the early 1900s that people started to realize how disrespectful and gross this was. There is a story about a famous artist who found out his tube of mummy brown was actually made of people. He was so horrified that he took the tube of paint into his garden and gave it a Christian burial. We literally consumed the past to make art. What about yellow? Yellow is the color of the sun. It is the color of gold. It should be happy. But in the history of art, yellow has a dark side. In the Middle Ages, yellow was the color of treachery. If you look at paintings of the Last Supper, look for Judas Iscariot, the man who betrayed Jesus. Almost always, he is wearing yellow robes. Why? Because yellow was seen as a fake gold. It was deceptive. It looked bright, but it wasn't valuable. Later, yellow became dangerous again. Artists like Van Gogh loved yellow, but to get a bright yellow, they used chrome yellow, which contained lead. Lead is toxic. Some historians wonder if Van Gogh's mental health issues were made worse by him licking his paintbrushes, slowly poisoning himself with the yellow paint he loved so much. So, colors aren't just decoration. They are snails, poisons, crushed rocks, and ancient bones. They are dangerous. But there is something else that's invisible, yet just as powerful. We have talked about what we see. Now, I want to talk about what we hear. We think of music as entertainment. We put on headphones to pass the time. We dance to it at parties. But the ancient Greeks, they didn't think music was entertainment. They thought it was medicine. They thought it was magic. They thought it was the code of the universe. Let's explore the lost world of ancient sound. To the ancient Greeks, music wasn't invented by a human. You didn't just pick up a stick and start banging a drum. Music was a gift from the gods. Specifically, it came from two very different gods. First, there was Apollo. He was the god of light, reason, and logic. His instrument was the lyre. Imagine a small harp made from a tortoise shell. It made a gentle, plucking sound. Plink, plink, blink. This music was calm. It was organized. It made you think clearly. Then, there was Dionysus. He was the god of wine, parties, and chaos. His instrument was the aulos. This was a double flute with a screeching, buzzing sound, like a bagpipe. This music was wild. It made you want to dance. It made you lose control. The Greeks believed that human life was a battle between these two sounds, the calm lyre and the wild aulos, order and chaos. This leads us to a fascinating idea called ethos. The Greeks believed that music could physically change your personality. Think about it. When you listen to a sad song, you feel sad. When you listen to a fast workout song, you feel energetic. The Greeks took this idea seriously. The philosopher Plato was actually afraid of music. He wrote that in his ideal city, certain types of music should be banned. He thought that if you listened to soft or lazy music, you would become a weak warrior. He thought if you listened to chaotic music, you would become a bad citizen who broke the laws. He wanted young people to only listen to the Dorian Madia, a specific scale of notes that sounded strong, brave, and manly. Imagine a government banning a song because they thought it would make the army lose the war. That is how powerful they thought music was. But if music could hurt you, it could also heal you. The Greeks were the first people to use music as actual medicine. They didn't have pills, they didn't have x-rays, but they had harps. If a patient came in with a fever, or was acting crazy, the doctor might prescribe a song. They believed that the human soul was made of harmony. When you get sick, your soul is out of tune. To fix the body, you have to tune the soul. Just like tuning a guitar. The famous mathematician Pythagoras, the guy with the triangle S, was obsessed with this. One day, legend says, he was walking past a blacksmith shop. He heard the hammers hitting the metal. Clang, clang, clang. He noticed that some hammers sounded good together, and some sounded terrible. He went inside and weighed the hammers. He realized that music wasn't magic, it was math. If one hammer weighed exactly half as much as the other, they sounded perfect together. Pythagoras decided that the whole universe was made of music. He called it the music of the spheres. He believed the planets made a humming sound as they spun in space, a giant cosmic symphony that we can't hear. He used this math to heal people. His followers would listen to specific songs in the morning to wake up their brains, and specific songs at night to calm down. It was the first time humans used sound to hack their own biology. What did this music sound like? Sadly, we don't really know. There are no recordings from 2,000 years ago. We have found a few broken flutes and some pictures on vases. We know about the kithara, a heavy wooden guitar used for big concerts. We know about the panpipes, used by shepherds, but the actual melodies, most of them are gone forever. However, there is one song that survived. It was carved onto a tombstone in Turkey. It is called the Siykilos Epitaph. The lyrics are beautiful and sad. They say, while you live, shine, have no grief at all. Life exists only for a short while, and time demands his due. It is a message from the past, a reminder to enjoy life while we have it, sung to a melody we almost forgot. So, we have learned that colors have a dark history. We have painted with blood, with poison, and with the dead. And we have learned that music was once seen as a divine force that could control our minds and heal our bodies. We are slowly building a picture of the past that is much more complicated than what we learned in school. It is a world of dangerous beauty, but we have one final journey to make. We have talked about food, buildings, art, and sound. Now, we need to talk about the two things that drive human history more than anything else: war and money. In the next part, we are going to solve the mystery of the Trojan War. Did it really happen? Was there really a wooden horse? And we are going to tell the story of money. How did we go from trading goats to using invisible numbers on a screen? Get ready, because the final chapter of our history marathon is going to be the biggest one yet. We have traveled through the gardens of Europe, the palaces of India, and the art studios of the past. But now, the mood must change. We are leaving the world of creation and entering the world of destruction. We are going to talk about the grandfather of all wars, a war fought not for land, and not for gold, but for something much more dangerous: pride. For thousands of years, people thought this story was a lie. They thought it was a fairy tale invented by a blind poet named Homer. They laughed at the idea that a city called Troy ever existed. But then, a man with a shovel proved them all wrong. Let's dig into the truth about the Trojan War. The story starts with a party, a wedding of the gods. Everyone was invited except Eris, the goddess of chaos. Angry at being left out, she threw a golden apple into the party. On the apple, it said, "For the fairest." Three powerful goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, fought over it. To settle the fight, they asked a human prince named Paris to choose the winner. Paris chose Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Why? Because she promised him a bribe. She promised him the most beautiful woman in the world. That woman was Helen. There was just one problem. Helen was already married. She was the queen of Sparta. When Paris took Helen back to his city of Troy, her husband, King Menelaus, didn't just get angry. He called his brother, the High King Agamemnon. They called every hero in Greece. They launched 1,000 ships to get her back. They sailed across the sea and laid siege to the mighty walls of Troy. For 10 years, they fought. Heroes like Achilles and Hector died in the dirt. Gods interfered. It was the ultimate drama. But for centuries, historians said, this is just a story. It never happened. Enter Heinrich Schliemann. Heinrich wasn't a professor. He wasn't a scientist. He was a rich businessman from Germany, and he was obsessed with the Trojan War. He read Homer's book, the Iliad, every night. He believed every word was true. He told the experts, "I am going to find Troy." The experts laughed at him. They said Troy was a myth, like Atlantis. But Heinrich ignored them. He took his money and his copy of the book, and he went to Turkey. He found a hill called Hisarlik. To everyone else, it was just a dusty hill. To Heinrich, it was a buried city. In 1870, he started digging, but he didn't dig like an archaeologist with a small brush. He dug like a madman. He used dynamite. He tore through the earth, destroying everything in his path. And then, he hit stone. He found massive walls. He found evidence of a great fire. And then, he found gold. He pulled out a stash of ancient jewelry, golden diadems, necklaces, and earrings. He was ecstatic. He shouted to the world, "I have found the treasure of Priam. I have found the gold of the king of Troy." He even took a picture of his wife wearing the ancient gold jewelry. It became a worldwide sensation. The myth was real, but there was a twist. Heinrich had dug too deep. In his rush, he had dug right past the Troy of the war. The gold he found belonged to a civilization that lived 1,000 years before Helena and Paris. But he was right about the location. Later, real scientists came in. They found that the hill wasn't just one city. It was a layer cake of 9 different cities, built one on top of the other over thousands of years. In the layer called Troy 7a, they found the truth. They found arrowheads. They found spear tips. They found piles of stones used for slingshots. And they found a thick layer of ash and charcoal. Around the year 1180 BC, this city was destroyed by a massive fire and a war. This matches the time of the legends perfectly. So, while the gods probably didn't come down from the clouds, the war was real. The fire was real. The destruction was real. But what about the horse? You know the story. The Greeks couldn't get inside the walls, so they built a giant wooden horse. They hid their soldiers inside. They sailed their ships away and left the horse as a gift. The Trojans dragged the horse inside. That night, the soldiers climbed out and opened the gates. Is it true? Archaeologists have never found a giant wooden horse, and honestly, wood rots. If it existed, it is gone. But there are 3 theories about what the horse really was. Ancient armies used siege engines to smash gates. These machines were often covered in wet horse hides to stop fire arrows. Sometimes, the battering ram had a metal head shaped like a horse. Maybe the poets turned a machine into a literal horse. Greek ships were sometimes called horses of the sea. Maybe the Trojan horse wasn't a statue, but a metaphor for a boat that snuck in. In Greek mythology, Poseidon is the god of the ocean, but he is also the god of earthquakes, and his symbol, a horse. Archaeologists found cracks in the walls of Troy that look like earthquake damage. Maybe a massive earthquake knocked down the walls during the siege. The people said, Poseidon, the horse, destroyed the walls. Over hundreds of years, the story changed from an earthquake to a wooden statue. We will never know for sure, but the story of Troy reminds us that civilizations are fragile. One day you are a powerful city with high walls, the next day, you are just a layer of ash in a hill. Now, we move to our final topic. We have talked about vegetables, buildings, colors, music, and war. What connects them all? Trade. You need to buy the seeds. You need to pay the builders. You need to buy the expensive blue paint. You need to pay the soldiers. We are going to talk about the invention of money. Today, money is invisible. It is a number on your phone screen. But it didn't start that way. Imagine a world with no money. You are a farmer. You have a cow. You want a pair of shoes. You walk to the shoemaker. You say, I will give you this cow for some shoes. The shoemaker says, I don't need a cow. I live in a small house. I need wood to fix my roof. Now you are stuck. You have a valuable cow, but you can't buy shoes. You have to go find a woodcutter, trade the cow for wood, and hope the shoemaker still wants the wood. This is called the coincidence of wants. It is a nightmare. It makes trade slow and difficult. Humans realized they needed something in the middle, something everyone wanted. First, they used things found in nature. In Africa and China, they used cowrie shells. These small white shells became the first global currency. Why? They were pretty, they were hard to break, and you couldn't fake them. In Rome, they used salt. Salt was precious because it kept meat from rotting. Soldiers were paid in salt. This is where we get the word salary. In Central America, the Aztecs used cocoa beans. Yes, chocolate money. You could buy a rabbit for 10 beans. And if the economy crashed, you could just eat your money. But shells break and beans rot. We needed metal. People started using lumps of gold and silver. But there was a problem. Every time you bought something, you had to weigh the metal. You had to test it to make sure it wasn't fake. It was slow. Then, about 2,600 years ago, a king in a place called Lydia, modern Turkey, had a brilliant idea. He took a lump of metal, he melted it, and he smashed a picture of a lion onto it. This stamp was a guarantee. The king was saying, I promise this metal weighs exactly this much. Suddenly, you didn't have to weigh it, you just had to count the lions. The coin was born. It changed the world. Trade exploded. Emperors realized that if they put their face on the coin, people would see them every day. Money became a tool of propaganda. But metal is heavy. If you are rich, carrying a bag of gold is dangerous. You can get robbed. While Europe was still using heavy coins, the Chinese invented something magic, paper money. They called it flying cash because it could blow away in the wind. When the explorer Marco Polo visited China, he was shocked. He told the Europeans, the emperor prints his red seal on mulberry bark paper, and people treat it like gold. The Europeans didn't believe him. How can paper have value? They asked. But the Chinese understood something important. Money isn't the paper. Money is trust. The paper is just a receipt. It is a promise from the emperor. And now, we are moving away from paper. We are returning to the invisible. Money is now data. It is ones and zeros flying through cables under the ocean. We have cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, which isn't controlled by any king or emperor. It is controlled by math. We have come a long way, from trading cows, to shells, to lions stamped on gold, to paper, to invisible data. But the rule is always the same. Money only works if we all agree to believe in the story. If we stop trusting it, it is just paper and numbers. So, here we are, at the end of our journey. We have spent hours together. We have dug through the soil to find the forgotten vegetables of this current, the medlar, the rampina that fed our ancestors. We have stood in the shadow of the Taj Mahal, a monument built on a foundation of wood and tears. We have seen how colors like green and white were once made of poison, and how blue was a holy treasure. We have listened to the ancient music of the Greeks, who believed a melody could heal the soul. We have walked the ruins of Troy, where a myth turned out to be real history, and we have watched money evolve from a cocoa bin to a digital code. What is the lesson here? The lesson is that the world is deep. Everything around you, with the food you eat, the money in your pocket, the song on the radio has a secret history. We usually think history is just a list of dates and dead people, but it's not. It is the story of human hunger, human love, human creativity, and human madness. It is the story of us. Thank you for taking this long journey with me. I hope your brain feels a little bit fuller than it did when we started. If you stuck around for this entire marathon, you are truly a legend. Please, do me one final favor. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lost world, hit that like button. And if you want more stories like this, please subscribe. My channel's name is Boring History Guy, but as we have proven tonight, history is anything but boring. Sleep well, dream big, and never stop digging for the truth.